What is a service worker lifecycle? I mean, what am I even talking about here? But honestly, this is an area that trips up a lot of new service worker developers, and I want to take a little bit of time to try to explain it to you today. Hey guys, Chris Love, the owner of Love to Dev, and today we're going to talk about the service worker lifecycle. Now, you may not have heard about this, especially if you have not started working with service workers, but this might be one of the more important topics that developers really need to master when they start learning service workers. Once you understand the service worker lifecycle, then you can start doing cool things like caching and push notifications. Now, what am I talking about when I talk about the lifecycle? Well, really what we're talking about is how is a service worker installed and what does the update process look like? Now, this trips up a lot of developers because when a service worker is initially registered and installed, it is not necessarily in control of the actual client that they're trying to debug through. So what typically happens is a new service worker developer writes a little bit of service worker code, registers it in their client-side code, and goes to the developer tools and tries to start debugging, but the fetch event never triggers. The activate event never triggers. The install event does trigger, and they're wondering what is going on. Why is my service worker not actually working? Well, there's honestly two reasons why your service worker may not be working yet. And the first one is there was an exception in your install event. Now, that's not necessarily part of the lifecycle, but it kind of is. And it is a common reason that service workers are not actually operating. Now, normally, if you're in the developer tools and you're looking at the service worker tab in the developer tools, you'll see like an error that's logged there, and you can actually go look at the error, usually in the console. But typically what's going on is if you try to pre-cache things and one of the files that you tried to pre-cache had an error like 404 or some 500 level error code, that causes that cache add all or any kind of cache add function to throw an exception. And anytime there's an exception in the install event handler, then the entire service worker registration fails. And that's why you're not seeing it. Now, we can go into that into another additional videos and stuff like that. And we've got some content on that in some of our courses as well. But today I really want to focus on the service worker lifecycle. Now, there are basically three phases to the service worker lifecycle. The first one, you must register the service worker. When a service worker is registered, then the service worker subsystem actually installs the service worker, and there's an event that you can capture at that point and do things. Next, when the service worker does become active, or actually becomes the service worker that's running against any potential clients within its scope, the activate event triggers. So those are three steps in the service worker lifecycle process. But there's more to it than that. Now, on the board here, I've drawn two different gears, each one representing a service worker. If we have an existing service worker running against a client scope, then this one's going to be running. But if we load a page and a new version of a service worker is now available, then the register and install event are going to trigger. And you're technically going to have two versions of the service workers running. However, service worker 2 is not in control of anything to do with any of those clients. And the reason is they don't want a new service worker potentially breaking an application. And this could really happen. Now think about it. If you've got even if you got just one client, but let's just say you have multiple clients, multiple tabs open in the browser is the easiest scenario. And one tab is constantly being used by the person, which triggers the second service worker to be loaded because now it actually notices that there's a new service worker available. Well, those other tabs are being controlled by this one, and the client-side code is actually synced up to think about this one being the service worker that's in control. But because you've got a new version, you could have potential breaking changes there. And you need to be aware of that. So what they do by default is this one sits and waits until all of the clients have been closed. This means all the browser tabs, any push notification clients, background sync clients. Just that you got to realize it may not necessarily mean that the browser tab is the only client under the scope of a particular service worker that is currently active. You may have to wait for some of those background tasks to close out as well. Remember, a service worker is a different thread, and it does not run in the scope of that UI thread that we're used to working with. And that's why this can get a little tricky, because there's going to be one instance of that service worker running, and it could actually control a numerous amount of different client experiences. Think about it. If you've been in any enterprises and you've seen line of business workers, a lot of times they will have multiple tabs open to the same line of business website, maybe on different pages, so they can see different things at the same time. So you need to be cognizant of those particular situations. Now, once all those clients are closed, then this particular service worker will then be terminated, and it will go off into the service worker graveyard, let's call it, okay? So it will no longer be in scope, no longer be available to it, and service worker 2 is now the service worker that's in control. And then you can start actually debugging your new service worker. Now, if you are absolutely positively sure that your new service worker will not break any existing clients that are open, they give you an opportunity to cause that new service worker to just jump ahead and take control. In your install event handler, you can call the skip waiting function, and this will cause the new service worker to take control. Just be aware, if something breaks, it's on you. So be very careful about this. At that point, the activate event will trigger, and then you can do any kind of cache cleanup or anything like that if you really need to. If you really wanted to, and you did that skip waiting, you might even get away with doing that in the install event. Highly recommend you debug this experience before you deploy it to make sure you're not going to break anything. And try to give yourself the ability to easily get out of those scenarios where something breaks. Now, one way that you can get away with it when you do the skip waiting is you can pass a message over to the UI thread that would then trigger something like a message going to the user and asking them to reload the page because you've made some background updates. Now, there's a lot of applications that employ that type of update process. So it's not something that's completely unfamiliar to end users, but you want to be very judicious in just throwing that around and think about a great way to actually provide them that experience. That way they know that it's safe or it's something that's okay to do. All right. So that gives you an opportunity to just make your service worker take control. Now, as a developer, that's going to be very convenient for us because we're trying to troubleshoot and get things done quickly. And a lot of times we may just put that skip waiting code in there before you ship it. I've got to tell you, make sure that everything is kosher with your application and you're not going to break anything, because you could get yourself into some sticky situations in deployment if you do that. I have personally been guilty of that because I didn't realize that I was breaking things. Now, once you've done that, obviously, your service worker is in control, and then your fetch event handler is going to trigger, your push notification events will trigger, your background sync events will trigger, and everything should have a nice happy dance at that point. Now, as a developer, if you don't want to put the code into your install event, but you do want your new service worker to become active so you can debug it, and that's exactly what I want to do. If you have the developer tools open, and if you're wanting to debug it, you probably already do, you can go to that service worker tab and you can manually do the skip waiting there, and that way you don't have to write the code in there, but you're still going to need to actually click the link to make the developer tools force that service worker to become active. Just remember to do that. Just because you do it, you may not necessarily realize certain things are going on. I know manually doing things in the developer tools is maybe not necessarily the best way to do it. It's a quick term fix. You may forget to do that from time to time. Sometimes I've had the thing where it's completely offline and I've totally forgot. So you need to be very careful when you do that to make sure you've got essentially a standard operating procedure that you follow, and you're going to know to manually do that. If not, go to the skip waiting, but also be sure to only ship that when you need to. So I hope this has teased you a little bit about service worker lifecycle. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more detail you can get into. There's a whole clients API and taking over those clients and managing those clients, talking to those clients, and to help you get better knowledge of the service worker lifecycle. We have a whole course on it's just dedicated to the service worker lifecycle, and that's because this is such an important topic, and it's much deeper than the surface stuff that I've talked about here in this short video. And I want to make sure that you are a developer that really understands how to do service workers and do them well. And understanding service worker lifecycle is one of the key aspects that is, like I said, is very overlooked by most developers. It's not common that we need to dive into something like that. But service workers are a much different programming paradigm than we're used to doing on the client side and even in Node. And just because they're JavaScript, we've got a lot of different things we have to understand and learn. So if you like this video or you found it useful, definitely hit the like button, share it with your friends. But as always, if you got questions, and I hope you really have a lot of questions, feel free to leave those in the comments section below, and I'd love to dialogue with you. And who knows, if the question's good and useful for a lot of folks, I'll try to make some more content dedicated just to the answer for your question, or maybe you've provided a good answer and I can go deeper with you on that as well. Thanks a lot. I'm Chris Love, the owner of Love to Dev, and I hope this video has been very helpful to you.